Hello everyone, today we talk about the Black Watch's military history. We are expanding a bit more into British warfare because there is a massive gap that I've always wanted to fill ever since, I was much younger, right? British military history is very important, especially from the 18th to the 21st century. We have just very few videos, so I'm thinking to expand on that. I see that for some reason you haven't been looking at sort of this video is more than much, but it really depends on what we're looking at. I don't know, the broader British strategy of the 7 Years' War, the conquest of India, etc. You may have heard lots of times. However, this channel maintains definitely a primarily military historical focus. I think I have scheduled different videos on von Clausewitz, and not just the theory, but also the explanation of Schwerpunkt itself, and more that I really would like to cover within this autumn. However, I still haven't expanded enough on other, especially 19th century history. Therefore, let's pass through this as well, through the incredible military history of the Black Watch. The Royal Highland Regiment, the 42nd, later the 73rd Regiment of Foot, and finally the 3rd Scots. We understand now what happened administratively speaking, carries this, in fact, very long legacy since the 18th century. In the long and bloody annals of the British Army, no regiment carries a darker, prouder, or more authentically Highland story than the Black Watch. Its true beginning lies not in the tidy muster rolls of 1740, but in the smoke, fire, and retribution of the disarmed Highlands 15 years earlier, when 10 small companies of hard-eyed clansmen first enforced the king's peace at the point of bayonet and broadsword in the same land. What follows in the video is probably the unbroken chronicle of that regiment, right, from the ruthless watch that broke the clans, because this was probably the original name, hence the formal one later, through 3 centuries of war across the globe to the red hackle that still flies today. So the independent companies of the 20s of the 18th century were far more active, far more ruthless, and far more feared than their modest, almost bureaucratic title ever hinted at, right? Scotland is not a civilized country. Like today, it is, but if we're talking military historical terms, we've seen how since the Middle Ages there's something off in terms of specific sort of military historical development types, especially in the Highlands. Admittedly, the lowlands were always sort of very receptive of the continent, but this, as we've seen, had produced continuity in a type of clanic tribal warfare was very reminiscent of the one of sort of the earlier Iron Age, and the medieval and modern companies of Gaelic warriors that we've seen in action also in other videos about early modern warfare across Europe were very reminiscent of, in fact, those early Celtic war bands of antiquity, regardless of the fact that now they also knew perfectly well how to use muskets, pikes, at least up to this point. I made a video about the development of linear tactics. That in the early 18th century, technically the pike was kind of still there in some sort of minimally relevant fashion. In any case, what we're seeing here is a quickly changing Britain, especially during the 17th century. The wars of the Three Kingdoms had profoundly reshaped the political fabric and general sort of alignment also of Scotland that had been basically fully subjected to England. And these, of course, there was a lot of factionalism within the Scottish Highlanders, which boiled down to very different types of political, confessional affiliation. We'll talk about figures like, Monroe's. Those are incredibly fascinating chapters. What we see here is essentially troops used to suppress the same Scottish rebellions. And raised in 1725 by General George Wade after the failed attempts to police the Highlands with regular troops, right, so of Englishmen, and other British, non-Scottish troops. These 6 later 10 companies of loyalist clansmen to the English coast were the government's answer to cattle raiding, blackmail, and lingering Jacobite unrest. This is happening all the time, like when you conquer a country. We've seen it, I don't know, Caesar's conquest of Gaul and more. There is always someone who, since the beginning, is even siding with you. Scottish history is very layered, in the sense it presents lots of traits of continuity, but is also surprisingly varied. And again, we'll get more into sort of basic Scottish history at some point, regardless of this specific military theme of today. Now, these companies, these loyalist companies, are universally recognized as the direct ancestors of the Black Watch. Their officers and many of their men transferred straight into the new regiment in 1739-40. From the long, jagged boundary that divided the untamed Highlands from the cultivated lowlands, a restless frontier that stretched from Dumbarton on the Clyde all the way northeast past Dunnet Head beyond the Dornoch Firth, these small, mobile detachments of hard-eyed Highlanders patrolled the landscape of racing burns, mist-shrouded quarries, and centuries-old blood feuds. Right, I had the utmost privilege of touring the entirety of the Scottish seaboard by car back in the day, and it's really a mystical experience. Incredibly beautiful, but in this sense brutal, primitive, mystical landscapes. And these men came straight from the same. They are an integral incarnation of that untamed nature and wilderness. Between 1725 and 1739, they conducted sweep after sweep through the glens, each one a miniature campaign in its own right, confiscating thousands upon thousands of muskets, broadswords, skean tubs, and dirks, all belonging to the ferocious Scottish guerrilla, and in the lifestyle of most Scottish farmers out there, habituated to cattle raiding, bit of cutthroating every once in a while, and specific hatred against the new British creation. Burning the bothies and stone houses of the Defiant to the ground, dragging recalcitrant clansmen before magistrates, and levying fines with the cold precision of accountants. Of course, these Scots knew perfectly well who they were targeting. They knew them. They were their same clanic rivals. They were, again, essentially settling some business, given also the pretty bloody history of Scotland in the previous generation, with all the vendettas that could stem from that. And we have their surviving journals preserved in the National Records of Scotland, filling thick leather-bound volumes with hundreds of pages of cramped, meticulous handwriting, irrefutable proof that long before the Black Watch ever wore a number on its buttons, its men had already shattered the armed power of their own people, essentially the Highland clans, and forcibly disarmed an entire nation. Right? What the English had essentially failed up to that point, at least to a degree, they had actually succeeded, but say in an absolute fashion to accomplish, the Scots did. Right? Almost every private soldier in the ranks was a gentleman, by the way, of the upper Highland gentry, a tacksman or close kinsman of the chief, however many generations removed. It was an everyday sight for a private to march with 1, 2, or even 3 personal gillies trailing behind, carrying his plate, rations, spear, brogues, and, when he was off duty, even his musket and broadsword. This was the fierce aristocratic material from which the future regiment was forged. Naturally, there were also simpler recruits. However, there was a lot of the old Scottish blood preserved properly in the elite nature of this unit that will, in fact, reveal itself as the perfect incarnation of the furor Scoticus, so to say, in the following centuries. The companies were genuinely independent. They had, for example, no regimental headquarters, no permanent depot, only scattered posts and stone barracks at strategic road ends and passes through the glens. This is, again, absolutely normal. Just imagine what early 18th century Scotland could be to begin with, right? And especially in the Highlands, without even the need of repeating it, like 3 companies came from Clan Campbell, one of each from Grant Munro and Fraser of Lovatt. 4 more were added in 1739. They retained their independent spirit also in the way they had been hired, as an almost paritary relation with the British monarch. In 1729, Captain James Campbell of Fonab's company stalked and captured the notorious robber chief Selmas Ruad MacGregor near Loch Rannoch, ending a decade of blackmail, cattle reaving, and terror along the braes of Rannoch and Atholl. In 1730, the Grand Company descended on the so-called Wild MacDonalds of Glencoe, burned their houses to the ground when they refused to surrender stolen cattle, and drove the survivors into the hills, as it was also kind of typical, right? That's where these men could continue resistance to guerrilla warfare that was countered by men that were equally knowledgeable of terrain and those tactics. In 1734, the Lovat, Frasers, and Munros fought a savage little pitched battle against a Cameron warband on the high braes above Loch Arkaig, leaving 8 dead on the heather and marching 20 prisoners in chains all the way to the toll booth at Inverness. No one has ever settled with absolute certainty how the name Black Watch in particular first arose. Watch, we have seen it, was straightforward enough. They were there to watch, to police, to keep the king's peace in a country that had never accepted it. But the origin of black remains stubbornly obscure. Their tartan was undeniably dark, almost funereal, in fact, in its deep greens and midnight blues, yet the regulation, scarlet jacket, and waistcoat should, in theory, have brightened the somber effect. Nice combination, color-wise, by the way. Beautiful contrast, too. Naturally, that's the broader British character that was given, right, as the United Kingdom to these also ethnic units as redcoats. Now, some insisted that the name Black Watch was a hostile coinage by resentful Highlanders who saw the companies as traitors wearing the government's clothes. Others claimed it referred to the black crime of extortion or blackmail they had been raised to stamp out. The earliest written appearance of the nickname Black Watch is a 1731 letter from a lowland officer. By 1737, it was in common use in official correspondence, so it's a pretty early denomination. Whatever the truth, as you know, nothing here sounds convincing, more just like a saying. The nickname stuck like burrs to a plate, and when Duncan Forbes of Culloden finally persuaded the government in 1739 to embody the 10 surviving companies into a proper regiment of foot, the name, the Black Watch, followed the men into the regular army, without argument, right? And this was the proper initiation in the British armed forces. Officially, the Black Watch were His Majesty's 43rd Highland Regiment of Foot, later renumbered 42nd in 1749, after the disbandment of Oglethorpe's 42nd, commanded by John Lindsay, 20th Earl of Crawford, with Sir Robert Munro of Fullis as lieutenant colonel. In the bright spring of 1740, the 10 independent companies were mustered together in a wide field near Taybridge and Aberfeldy, the moment the Black Watch formally stepped onto the stage of British military history. The Master Field is still marked today by the Black Watch monument erected in 1887. I, in fact, inserted it in the pictures as well. That's the moment in which the higher spirit of the unit was first manifest. They became the 43rd Regiment of Foot under the Earl of Crawford, a Lowlander and the only senior officer without a Highland name, among a glittering list of Grants, Campbells, Monroes, Mackenzies, McLeans, and Stewarts. The uniform was the classic 12-yard belted plate, wrapped tight around the waist and pinned over the left shoulder so that when rain lashed the hills, it could be thrown loose and wrapped around both body and firelock for protection. At night it became a warm, if rough, blanket, but, the Scots were, again, not particularly sensitive nor, to such trivial feelings like human mercy, and evidently not even just to such Spartan lifestyle. In barracks, the men changed to the shorter filabeg or little kilt. They carried standard government-issue long-land pattern muskets with socket bayonets and the magnificent basket-hilted broadsword. Right? Almost every man privately added his own brace of pistols, a dirk thrust through the belt, and sometimes even an old-fashioned targe slung across the back. Right? We have described part of the sort of the also the Highlander. Burr Scottish is also just about the Lowlanders in different times in history, mostly the Middle Ages, in fact, obviously, as they were born. And in the Renaissance. So you see that especially also side weapons and the taste for, cold steel, melee, almost wrestling, like hand-to-hand combat was very pronounced. These were people who up to literally the previous century were chopping themselves to pieces on foot with one another without armor, with double-handed swords, right? And, keeping to fight amidst the blood and the guts. This is psychocultural mentality and horizons from which they emerged. The regiment was the last in the British Army to carry the broadsword into battle until 1856, in fact, and kept the targe as a literal piece of medieval legacy in its armory, at least, until the 1930s. The question of tartan had caused endless argument for years. I also discussed this with Veritas and Carus, he pointed that out. Some companies had worn their own clan sets, others a plain hodden grey or none at all. By 1727, a dark, deliberated, unclannish pattern was being woven in Strathspey for the Grand Company, and soon every company received bowls of the same cloth. I talked a little bit about how dress uniforms worked this time. You would think this was the age of uniform, but it wasn't even so uniform as you may imagine. You can argue not even today, like in terms especially of gear. Everybody goes out in the same way. But remember that after a couple of months of campaign, no uniform exists anymore. This time, so this again was in part the last of the issues, but of course it helped to also psychologically frame this unit into something more cohesively unitary, all right, and projected towards a glorious future. By 1733, the dark government tartan black, very dark green and navy blue with a narrow overcheek of black was in general use across all 10 companies. When the regiment was formally embodied in 1740, it kept that same dark set, made even more somber in the little kilt by the later addition of a single narrow red line granted by Lord John Murray. This government or Black Watch set is the oldest documented regimental tartan still in existence, by the way, because there are others. The embodiment was not welcomed everywhere. Many chiefs feared losing their best fighting men to permanent service because they were landlords, like they had their own business at home, as I've seen the upper gentry, aristocrats, and so of course they had earned their place in the military, in society, within the newer British order. However, there were still Scotsmen. They weren't simply abandoning their own autonomy, ambitions, and more. And in this sense, they actively started discouraging even enlistment. The Earl of Crawford had sent recruiting parties as far as the Long Island and the Eustace. Yet, when the regiment paraded at Aberfeld in May 1740, it could muster only 960 men, instead of the authorized 10,080. The shortfall was filled by drafting in lowland recruits who were hastily taught a few words of Gaelic, because as you know, these areas had historically anglicized, quite early compared to the Highlands, and issued kilts, an experiment that lasted mere months before the lowlanders were quietly transferred out again, in fact unable to stomach either the language or the food, but still revealing in this sense the incredibly sturdy and sort of brutal background of the Highlanders. Training was fierce and enthusiastic under the enormous Lieutenant Colonel Sir Robert Monroe, Foley's a giant whose girth would later cause him to become stuck fast in a French entrenchment. But these were, again, especially as Northern European aristocrats in the Celtic French, people who had been traumatically selected from a genetic point of view for the aforementioned type of fighting. And so they were incredibly sort of interesting pieces of anthropological evidence of how war at least can select out specific individuals. In 1740, 2 Highland soldiers were sent south to London at the personal request of King George II, who had never seen a real Highlander in the flesh. And it was his subject anyway. In the great gallery of St. James Palace, they performed the full broadsword exercise and the intricate maneuvers of the Lochaber axe. That was, again, a thing from the times of Bannockburn and even before. We've seen it also in Pictish warfare partially. Before the king, the Duke of Cumberland, Marshal Wade, and half the generals in London displaying such dazzling dexterity that each man received a gratuity of 1 guinea, which they immediately handed to the palace porter as they left, according to Highland custom. In March 1743, the regiment received sudden orders to march south to England. Assured by Duncan Forbes and others that the king merely wished to inspect them, the Highlanders covered the 26 days from Perth to Finchley Common in easy stages of 12 to 18 miles a day, camping in the open, cooking oatmeal and salt beef over peat fires, astonishing the countryside wherever they passed. Local gentry invited the officers to dinner and crowded around to stare at the wild Highlanders. It was definitely an attraction, an exceptional sight. At High Wycombe, the townspeople pelted them with apples, bread, and cheese in welcome. In London, the king reviewed them on Hyde Park and ordered a full demonstration. Volleys by companies advanced at the double, the complete manual of the broadsword. Thousands watched, spellbound. Cheap prints of the spectacle were sold on every street corner within hours. When the regiment was then ordered to Flanders, the men believed they had been deceived. On the march south, a rumor spread that they were bound for the deadly West Indies plantations. After all, the Scotsmen, had to serve some purpose, right? At Ladywood near Oundle, the regiment mutinied for this reason. This tells you already what kind of sort of feeble connection and trust exists between the Black Watch and sort of the British monarch. They mutinied, led by Corporals Malcolm and Samuel Macpherson and Private Farquhar Shaw, and began marching back to Scotland. As a consequence, intercepted and surrounded, they surrendered in hope of a pardon, but the 3 ringleaders were court-martialed and shot on Tower Hill on July the 18th, 1743. The mutiny of 1743 remains the only recorded instance of an entire British regiment mutinying en masse in the 18th century. Their bodies lay beneath the gallows for 5 years until in 1748 the regiment quietly petitioned for their return. Permission was granted, and the bones were brought north and buried with full military honors in the churchyard at Loggerate, while the pipes played the haunting lament "Chac til mi tuile," which I'm not pronouncing correctly, but still, "We shall return no more," which is beautiful, and it echoes again. If you look at those videos on Pictish warfare, the very mentality of the Highlanders, this idea of a sort of dark world out there that had to be sort of brightened by the deeds of these heroes, and that, however, would also fall in battle out there. It's incredibly dark and sort of spiritual vision of this brutal existence. No other British regiment has ever performed such an act of loyalty and remembrance for executed mutineers, and this speaks volumes of the 18th century Scottish feelings at large, the Highlanders in particular. That same year, the 43rd, renumbered the 42nd after Oglethorpe's short-lived 42nd was disbanded, sailed for Flanders and received its baptism of fire at Fontenoy on May 11, 1745. If you're interested, I have a video on Maurice of Nassau. I also made a video about the post-Fontenoy British military reforms, especially as far as the North American theater was concerned. So it's all baked into the wall when you look at Black Watch and the context which the British military was developing as a reflection of continental and colonial strategic necessities. Fontenoy was the first battle honor formally awarded to the regiment and is still carried on the colors. Posted on the extreme right facing the wood of Barry, they were first ordered forward under Colonel Ingoldsby, who inexplicably halted and refused to advance. By the time they were shifted to the left to prop up a collapsing Dutch attack, the Highlanders were frantic for action. Led by the immense Sir Robert Munro, kilts tucked high, they stormed the French redoubts with broadsword, targe, and raw fury, arms they had begged special permission to use that day. Munro ordered his men to clap to the ground each time the French fired, remaining standing himself with the colors because he could not lie down quickly enough, as big he was. Over the first line of entrenchments, they poured like avenging furies, but French musketry was sustained, accurate, and deadly. Munro became wedged fast in a ditch and barely escaped capture. More than 30 were killed and nearly 90 wounded, yet the Duke of Cumberland singled them out for praise and granted their request the two comrades sentenced to flogging be pardoned on the spot. While the regiment lay in Flanders, Prince Charles Edward landed in the West Highlands in the summer of 1745. Some of you have asked me to make a video on this, and as I was saying in the beginning, we'll gradually get there. Three additional service companies had been raised in Scotland. One was destroyed at Prestonpans, another fought for the government at Culloden with Dugald Campbell of Auchrassan. The main battalion was hurriedly recalled, not to fight fellow Highlanders, but to guard the south coast against French invasion, which was also a possibility in this attempt of, in fact, regime change in Britain. Culloden came and went without the Black Watch ever firing a shot upon their countrymen, a source of lasting pride within the regiment. The Black Watch is the only Highland regiment that never fought against the Jacobites in 1745-46. In the Flanders campaign of 1747, a single company under Captain John Campbell of Carrick earned the lasting terror of the French cavalry. At the skirmish of Beaumont, a company of the 42nd charged and routed two full squadrons of the Régiment Royal Étranger, killing the colonel outright and capturing the standard. French officers spoke for years afterwards of les Écossais du diable, the devil Scots, the Scots of the devil. The 2nd Battalion, raised in 1758, was recruited so quickly that many men arrived at Perth still wearing civilian clothes and carrying their own broadswords. Tailors worked day and night stitching scarlet cloth. The regimental books record 2,847 pounds spent on red broadcloth in the first 6 weeks alone. The battalion sailed for the West Indies with 1,100 men and returned in 1765 with 114. This is a 7 Years' War. It just again made a miniseries about that, and we've seen actually the British in action exactly in those theaters. Yellow fever, malaria, and black vomit had done what French and Spanish bullets could not. I widely discussed this, especially in Cuba. Their widows and orphans received no pension. Only a brief cold note in the London Gazette marked their passing. At Ticonderoga in July 1758, the Highlanders, now officially royal and wearing blue facings on their scarlet coats, charged of their own furious volition with the broadsword across a breastwork of sharpened tree trunks and thorny abatis at the disastrous Battle of Carillon. They fell in windrows before close-range French musketry, losing over half their strength, yet surged forward again and again until orders had to be shouted 3 times before they would retire. They really wanted to rip those French guts, but they paid a staggering price for that. In fact, half the regiment, 314 killed and 333 wounded, which in and of itself is a hell of a proportion, meaning that wounded are sort of multiple times normally the killed. Here they had probably gotten hand down against the French, frontally lay on the blood-soaked clearing. This remains the singles highest casualty percentage suffered by the regiment in one action, over 67%. In gratitude, the king made them the 42nd, at this point, Royal Highland Regiment of Foot. 3 new companies were rushed from Scotland and a 2nd battalion formed. They were granted the title Royal and the right to wear blue facings, for the first British regiment to receive royal status while still numbered rather than named. In the forests of North America, the Light Company perfected a style of skirmishing almost indistinguishable from later rifle tactics. I also discussed how the British, in fact, were ahead in these matters. I also made a video about the Pennsylvania rifle, as it was properly called. We described what that was about, really. We talked about also skirmishers during the Napoleonic Wars, what had been the deal with them early on. There was a very interesting sort of sharp shooting tradition that the British also, during the Napoleonic Wars will further implement. If you have watched Sharp, you know more or less what we're talking about. Faces blackened with wet gunpowder, the Highlanders crawled forward on their bellies through long grass, firing and loading from behind trees or rocks. At Bushy Run in 1763, they helped relieve Fort Pitt during Pontiac's rebellion. They fought along Island, Harlem Heights, Piscataway, Brandywine, Germantown, and Monmouth, and were present at the siege of Charleston in 1780 during the War of the United States independence. So here there's a record of sort of very, so the unit is pretty large. We could obviously say much more about the single vicissitudes of the same, but it mostly becomes a record of pretty sort of heroic feats. For example, on the night of March the 20th, 1801, camped beside the ruins of Nicopolis before the Battle of Alexandria, Private Donald MacLeod wandered from the fires and vanished. Next morning, he was found unharmed, sitting on a fallen column, speaking only Gaelic, and claiming to have conversed all night with the spirits of the ancient dead. Right? Surely some Gallic mercenary, some Celtic mercenary, at the Ptolemaic service would have visited him as one of his past ancestors from those lands. At Abu Qir on March the 8th, 1801, the 42nd led the center of the British landing under murderous fire, fixed bayonets, and charged up the dunes, hurling the French back in confusion. At Alexandria in 1801, Major Stirling captured a French standard. Sergeant Sinclair carried it until wounded. The regiment helped drive the French from Egypt entirely. At Alexandria, the battle in the city, 13 days later, Major Stirling captured a French standard. Sergeant Sinclair carried it until wounded. And the regiment helped drive the French from Egypt entirely. The captured French color of the 61st Regiment of the Line is still held in the Black Watch Museum since, not then, but, as by the Black Watch. At Corunna, the Piper Major John MacLeod was wounded 3 times, yet played on until he could no longer stand. These acts of heroism were obviously not random in this case, because the Piper player, Piper Major, was very much chosen, just like bearing a standard in this function, as one of the single most characteristic features of the unit, of not only the Black Watch, but with very specific attachment to the say. So you find throughout all military history, standard bearers literally dying, still essentially in place. At times in the Middle Ages, you have standard bearers that still were found dead on horseback with the banner still in their hand, right, clasped. Back at Corunna, when the French finally overran the position, John MacLeod was bayoneted against a stone wall, still clutching the pipes, in fact. And so, typical of that mentality, of that, as we've seen, also harshness and sort of primitive behavior that granted this extraordinary results. The shattered instrument, by the way, drone pierced by French steel, was recovered in 1815 and returned to the regiment. It had been preserved, in fact, by the French as an actual trophy of war, and it also hangs today in the Black Watch Museum at Bellozi Castle. Throughout the long Peninsular War, the 1st Battalion of the Black Watch fought at Corunna. We've seen Busaco, Fuentes de Oñoro, Ciudad Rodrigo, Badajoz, Salamanca, Burgos, Vitoria, the Pyrenees, Nivelles, Nimes, Orthez, and Toulouse. All right, so they cross obviously into France. And so for each of these battles, we could look at some point what the Black Watch did. The 2nd Battalion marched an astonishing 3,400 miles in 4 years, more than any other British regiment, crossing the Pyrenees 6 times, fording rivers under fire, fighting in 23 general actions and countless skirmishes. The Scots were getting sort of now barely civilized, and so they weren't even so psychophysically wired to the wilderness of some of the most rugged and terrible landscapes in Northern Europe to fight in. But in this sense, the Iberian hinterland and its nightmarish essence, in fact, along the southern European theaters, you can't really know between Spain, Italy, and Greece, the Balkans, which is really the wars, right? But the Scots were pretty good on this terrain as well and distinguished themselves on multiple occasions. Shows these marches, this capacity of sort of going back and forth really with an atrocious physical resilience. Shoes wore out so often as a consequence that the men bound their feet in rawhide cut from dead bullocks. At Toulouse, on Easter Sunday 1814, they attacked uphill through terraced vineyards and olive groves, driving the French from 3 successive ridges, only to discover Napoleon had already abdicated. At Waterloo, the 42nd reduced to a shadow after the slaughter at Quatre Bras, where Lieutenant Colonel Sir Robert Macara was killed by a lance thrust through the chin, formed part of Pack's battered brigade. When French lancers unexpectedly thundered into their rear through chest-high rye, the flank companies had only half formed the square before cavalry and Highlanders collided in the center in terrible confusion. The Highlanders closed around the Lancers, who had penetrated and cut them down to the last man. Though the cost was fearful, command changed 3 times in minutes. Almost 300 of the regiment fell in the 2 battles. The regiment's stand at Waterloo earned it the unique honor of having Waterloo embroidered on the regimental colors in gold rather than the usual silver. In the Crimea, and I have a series on that, we documented also this in the various battles, the newly formed Highland Brigade, 42nd, 79th, and 93rd under Sir Colin Campbell, advanced at the Alma, in a determined line of dark tartan and red coats, firing steady volleys as they marched up the slope beneath the great redoubt. The Russians broke almost at once on that occasion. Then you have the famous episode of the thin red line that we discussed for the Battle of Balaclava, which is, in the sense, usually credited to the 93rd Sutherland Highlanders, but the 42nd and the 79th were immediately adjacent and part of the same 2-rank line that notoriously repelled the Tsarist cavalry. This action is quite relevant because, as you know, it was essentially an insightful yet bold, and at least successfully so, realization of the increased amount of firepower. The rifles, we discussed it partly for that war in a technical for that series about the Crimean War in a technical sense, that literally butchered Russian horsemen, right, and withstood, like, with an unprecedentedly thin, in fact, line that was seen on the distance is this red coast trail. During the Indian Mutiny, this we have to discuss yet instead, the regiment captured a great bronze gong at Cawnpore, which has told the hours in the guardroom ever since. Colonial history. Tel-el-Kebir in 1882, the Highland Brigade advanced across the desert in perfect alignment at dawn, pipes playing, the barren rocks of Aden. The charge that followed took less than 15 minutes. The kilt proved unexpectedly useful in loose sand, letting the men run faster than troops in trousers. In the burning Sudan of 1884-1885 at Kirkban, the battalion advanced in extended order across boulder-strewn ground. The Mahdists waited until the Highlanders were within 100 yards before opening fire from concealed positions. Bayonets were fixed and the ridges cleared one by one until the enemy fled. At Magar's Fortain in 1899, the Black Watch marched all night in silence and pouring rain toward a ridge they believed held sleeping Boers. Dawn revealed the enemy awake and perfectly entrenched behind barbed wire and machine guns. Things were really changing, as you know, at the very end, especially the last 2 decades. As a grim consequence, in this case, of the 900 Highlanders who advanced, 300 fell killed or wounded in mere minutes, among them the beloved brigade commander, Andrew Wauchope. The survivors lay all day under accurate rifle fire, so intense that men were hit while raising their heads to drink. Magersfontein remains the single worst day in the regiment's history for officer casualties in particular. 21 killed or mortally wounded. There was an idea that British officers didn't duck. This was a bit of a myth, especially in the South African theater, had to teach them if that was really the case. That was not a good idea anymore. It's mostly a myth from the Great War, but it is true that before this era, there was an immense, we've seen it before at Fontenoy, for example, this immense pride, other than in that case, literal physical sort of gigantistic reasons for not being literally able to duck under fire, especially as long as the smoothbores were around, actually standing as an officer, even though sharpshooters did exist, the rifles technically already existed, as we've seen from pretty early on in conventional warfare. The moral effect, right, made up for the actual killing rate, which was relatively scarce in precise terms, right? At this point, things started to quickly change. And you can imagine, as we've seen before here, the Highlanders had historically been among the most proud of the British units, as far as also properly taking on the enemy front with enormous bravery, and also at some point with that pinch of Celtic madness that already in antiquity at some point would have them, risk everything and lose everything in certain circumstances. In the Great War, other painful, of course, but also glorious chapter, the Territorial 7th 5th Battalion earned the nickname the Ladies from Hell, or the Lads from Hell, after a night raid, in particular near Arras, in March of 1917. Kills stuck up, faces blackened, armed only with bayonets and knockberries, they crossed no man's land in total silence, killed or captured every sentry in a 200-yard stretch of German trench, and returned with 40 prisoners without a single casualty. Literally a journey to hell and back. And the prisoners were so terrified that they refused to believe the raiders were human. I mean, imagine this sort of brutal Northern European types with their faces darkened because, of course, their white face didn't have to be recognized even by through a glimpse of light, and therefore appearing as utterly demonic forces, right? And there you have properly that, again, Celtic ambushing, infiltration tactics that the ancestors of this guy had practiced for millennia, right? It's almost encoded in their genes. It's as if it were muscle memory. And of course, that's actually a very good soldiery attributed to the broader British military culture of the era, right? But this was also top-notch unit, and this action remained, among others, by the way, that here we're not listing, pretty famous. And by the way, that's in fact an enemy nickname, the Ladies from Hell, because it's the German press at that point that widely used the term die Damen aus der Hölle, the Ladies from Hell, after this and other similar raids in which seemingly the black watch, so black and even more in this case, distinguish themselves, right? It's something, again, rigid, austere, right? Stern, right? Properly funereal, even in this otherwise incredibly, at some point, bloody and probably in the heat of combat, right? Whatever could be unleashed from this man that was enacted. Trench warfare is quite fascinating. We talk about these kind of infiltration tactics that were at some point veritable masterpieces that you had to calculate the rhythms of the unit out there, calculate every what you would find in every inch of land, and the light or the absence of the same, given hour and so on. Everything, it's an incredibly complex system, and so mostly it's a matter of leadership. And these men, however, are also the ones that can mostly succeed in this. The 6th Battalion's attack at Beaumont-Hamel on November the 13th, 1916 was one of the costliest single actions of the war. Advancing through fog and mud that sucked men to their knees, they met point-blank machine gunfire. In less than an hour, 24 officers and 562 men of the 700 who went over the top were gone. Right? Brutal page, which again you can see how you can be surprised, you can mismanage, and you're going to be cut down to pieces. In the Second World War, the 1st Battalion fought from Dunkirk to the Reichswald, crossing the Rhine in buffaloes under an artificial smoke screen. In Burma, the 2nd Battalion endured the Chindit columns, months of jungle, monsoon rain, and Japanese ambushes, flown out at last more dead than alive from disease and starvation. On the Hook, in Korea, November 1952, the Chinese attacked in waves of 200 every 15 minutes for 8 hours. Just cannon fodder, kill a Chinese. There's another one. It is a joke and not a joke. The trenches were overrun 3 times and retaken 3 times with grenade and bayonet. When dawn came, the dead lay piled 4 deep. Over 400 Chinese bodies were counted before the wire. When you say that body count does matter, right? The defense of the Hook is still studied at Sandhurst as a textbook example of small unit defensive fighting, sort of defense, withdrawal, attack, counterattack. Really incredibly fascinating piece of military art. So, what you see, this thing continued. As a matter of fact, there are different actions of more recent warfare, right? And today's video was not really a filler or anything, sort of thought to be less relevant, but there's all a further history that encapsulates the through the details alone, like the immense history of this force. We can't merely again discuss this today. This video is just like treat it as a teaser, right? As an intro, as something just to look at the origins and the most famous actions of the Black Watch. What you can say is that, as we've seen throughout 3 centuries, the traditions endured unbroken. Until 1945, every record was towed the Highland fling and sword dance on his first night in barracks, for example. And it's not like they would learn only that, but it was a matter of identity, of pride, that stiffened, also resolve to the grueling pace of military training that, as you know, is properly designed to destroy people, because nobody needs people, and to actually create purely slaughtering machines, because we need that, and thank God the military provides us with it. The officers' mess silver still included the snuff mull made from the hoof of Bonnie Prince Charlie's horse, taken after Culloden and presented in 1747. That's when you say it's epic, right? And that's why we need to tell the story, the one of Bonnie Prince Charlie. The regimental march remained Highland Letty, quick, and the Black Bear slow. Unchanged since 1745. The pipes still played the Highland man's knee buckle when moving off on parade. The famous red hackle was granted in 1795 after the regiment was mistaken for French at Gilders-Malsen in the Low Countries. The men tied red feathers from a French officer's hat into their bonnets to distinguish themselves at that point. And even after the 2006 amalgamation
into the Royal Regiment of Scotland. The third Scots, the Black Watch, continued to draw almost all its recruits from Perthshire, Angus, Fife, and Dundee, because these are all territorial units, right? And this is beautiful, like in British history as well. This is true, like most countries in Europe, indeed, but there is something very sort of provincially original of these people. All soldiers watching the Young Battalion parade at the 2014 Commonwealth Games remarked that the faces beneath the red hackle looked exactly like the photographs from Flanders 1914, Egypt 1882, and even though Fontenoy 1745 didn't yield pictures to us, if not in paintings, they would have really looked the same, all right? And so there is a very ethnic continuity in these forces. In fact, from the 10 companies mustered on the banks of the Tyne 1739-40, as we've seen at the beginning, to the last battles in Helmand in 2014, the Black Watch, whether number 43rd, 42nd, or simply the 3rd Scots, this can be confusing, but it's really not. The structure, again, is a bit complex, but again, today we don't even talk about this. We roughly saw how things went. Served on every continent, save Antarctica. They fought in every major British war for almost 300 years and hardly ever failed to take an objective given to it. But what is fascinating about British military culture that is reflected also in other, for example, I don't know, the Special Air Service, for example, as the best special force in the world. Why? Right? It's because the sheer variety of theaters in which they were employed, the sheer amount of experience that was passed down, taught, repeated, not just like the mere tradition of the unit, or some original combativeness. Of course, here we have emphasized, of course, the Scottish background, and especially in the early eras, like the sheer brutality of Scottish, culture, military culture. But aside from this, there is something really more comprehensively earned across all the world, right? And this is something must never be forgotten. Experience is incredibly precious. The Black Watch holds the record for the most battle honors, over 180 of any British infantry regiment, which speaks by itself in the incredibly rich, in fact, as we just said, British military legacy. The names carved on the collars and the memorials at Balhusey Castle are only the visible part of a story that stretches from the heather hills of Breadalbane to the poppy fields of Helmand, carried forward by generations of men who all shared the same quiet, fierce pride in wearing the red hackle and the dark tartan of the watch. I hope that this was sort of a good appetizer. I still, for some reason, can't make proper, especially modern contemporary British military content as I would like to, even though there is actually a lot of material, right? It shall really be a bit more, to make a bit more of an effort, right? But definitely we also have a lot to do, a lot to improve. As I see here, I have a playlist about contemporary British, let's say modern British warfare, that includes, in fact, also the pre-United Kingdom Scottish warfare as well. It's not as small, actually. At this point, we made 23 videos. It's not an incredibly popular playlist, but there's a bit of everything, actually. And here, actually one as an exception is Romano-Brittonic Arthurian warfare. Now, it doesn't belong here, sorry. So we fell at 22, but plus this one, we're 23. And contemporary British warfare should be richer than I expected. We have to finish, by the way, the Crimean War series, only 12 contemporary British warfare. Yeah, we should really make more. I understand that this stuff, for some reason, as I said at the beginning, is not as watched as other type of content. And again, this videos can definitely, especially to, I don't know, I have here, I see from the stats, let me check how many people watch from where. Subdivision, region, watch length, altogether, United States. All right, and second is Britain, as a matter of fact, United Kingdom. So, yeah, but it's minimal, right, compared to the Americans. You're all Americans. How's that? It's sort of weird. Americans make for 43% of visualization time. This may be a tactic, by the way. Then we have, interestingly enough, United Kingdom, Italy. We then had never reached so high so far, and actually even with not a bad watch length, Germany, Australia, Canada, Poland, the Netherlands, Sweden, Serbia, France, Brazil, Romania, Belgium, Finland, Chile, Spain, Ireland, India, Norway, Czechia, Greece, Austria, Croatia, Japan, Bulgaria, Argentina, Denmark, Slovakia, South Africa, Portugal, Ukraine, Mexico, Hungary, Cuba as well. But here we are descending a bit into the oblivion, so to say, because it's not really too many views after all. And here, again, I'm glad, if anything, that we had all this. So far, again, certain days are crazy. You have no idea what happens in my life at large. I very equilibristically maintain my own balance amidst all this stuff. I have a lot of work, and so that's why also this videos could be better made. Like, I take a great pride of having lots of videos made in advance, but sometimes, like, I don't have time during the day to see what I have to do in the evening and whatever. So sometimes the approach is so. But in any case, I think if you look at, for example, British warfare as a whole in my videos, there is a lot of medieval stuff as well, right? So, but it feels all so scattered. I mean, for some reason, I don't know. British warfare, only 83 videos. So it's very mixed. Again, there is really a lot from different ages, from different times, from antiquity to contemporary. So that's why it feels like we haven't covered really much and well, right? But it's videos like these that have probably the task to fill the gap. For that matter, I don't think we have anything like British history as a whole. No. Well, yeah, we have medieval British history, not modern British history, just warfare. I think the only stuff I've ever made was warfare from those eras, so we could easily sum them, and so it would be something like probably more than I thought. Something like 140 videos about British history, British warfare. So I should create that playlist, so maybe people come look at that. I don't know. Medieval British history. Not very watched playlists. But hey, what can you do? Like, you have to accept that just people are going to be more or less interested in particular topics. And again, but as I said at the beginning of the video, I've always had this thing that I wanted to learn British history well. And so there's so much to learn that in many ways it's sort of very demanding amidst also the rest of what we have to cover as a whole. So we go on with not much of a fatigue in particular days. Like, for other reasons, one can be fatigued, and now I have to go to sleep because I don't reason anymore. In any case, it's pleasant. I can see Now not because it's dark, but I can see from here from my window snow on the mountains here. So we're really we're below zero already from a while, and in any case, it's a good time. It's a pleasant autumn. This is my favorite season, but when I get into it, it always feels like hyper stressful. I want to sleep, not all the time, but that's the point. I feel too hyped at some point, and then I need to rest, right? So we have this ondulatory trend, and we'll see what we can do with rest. For today, in any case, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.